everyone, and welcome to the very first Silver Pride keynote. My name is Fiona Anderson. I'm a senior lecturer in art history at Newcastle University. I'm really pleased to be here with Sunil Gupta, artist, curator, educator, activist. We're going to be talking about his life and work. So looking back at his life and work from the 1970s to the present. Some of you might have seen Sunil's work recently at his retrospective From Here to Eternity at the Photographers Gallery. Welcome, Sunil.
Hi, Fiona. Nice to see you again.
Yeah. Nice to see you. Should we just dive right in?
I think so, because there's so much of it. Let's go in
there. There's so much. Let's start in Montreal in the 70s. So I thought it would be really interesting to start with this body of work that known as Friends and Lovers, about your experience in Montreal and Canada in the 1970s and your friends and your community there. Could you say a bit about how you came to be in Montreal and how this series came about, how you started taking photographs there?
Yeah, well, very briefly, I was born and raised in New Delhi, but at the age of 15, I was transported to Montreal from one parent to the other. And interestingly, this body of work was only recently displayed for the first time in 2018 at my gallery in Toronto. Although it's dealing with the 70s, it's pictures that I had begun to take of my friends and family, and then of course the kind of very nascent gay scene that I found in Montreal. It took me a little while as a migrant to figure out where it was, but I was greatly aided in that by our university group, which was called K. McGill in those days. Mm-hmm. So I joined that, and there I found a kind of community that was much more open and interesting to me, and a much more useful, I guess, identity, like the notion of identity suddenly, in a way that was that my Indianness was completely useless in 1969 in Canada. Essentially, nobody had heard of India. So if I said I was Indian, everyone thought I was native Canadian and had wandered in from some reservation. So there was that kind of thing going on. So this project, in a way, encapsulates a lot of my interests over the years. They're both casual pictures and deliberate pictures. They're event pictures, like documentary, like this, very early gay rights march that was embedded within a May Day workers' march. So my introduction to these marches was through those kind of labor politics right from the start, and the gay pride was coming out of there. And that sign in French reads "Workers and Gays in Solidarity."
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really interesting, that kind of relationship of gay organizing in this period to other political struggles, that how important solidarity is to the sense of pride.
Yeah, exactly. And so we see, yeah. So also through the university group, we had a little community newspaper called Gazette. And Gazette published the pictures. So as an amateur, because I was really in business school in my university days, and I was doing this as a hobby. So I was self-taught, but I was able to publish the pictures, and then I had an audience as well. And there were these two kinds of pictures. On the left were the news-related ones of the marches. On the right were the other kinds of news, which in that, what we're looking at is a fire that happened in one of the gay bathhouses in Montreal, where some people died in that. This was quite, the gay scene, the commercial gay scene in Montreal then was very much run by the mob, by organized crime. it's something that comes up occasionally, not much mentioned, but we were operating under the commercial interests of the mob. And every now and then somebody who was running some part of it got murdered or something, but didn't directly affect you in a sense. Because I got summer jobs in these places, and I began to realize that the owners were not to be messed with. Yeah.
So these two locations, you've got the streets and the kind of protests that are happening
Yeah,
there, and
yeah,
then
and the kind of the
bars and
scene.
bathhouses. Yeah.
Yeah, and you can see the papers advertising things like gay trip. At the
Hmm.
bottom, there's that newly emerging gay groups around religious affiliations. There's a
Hmm.
Jewish one there, but I remember there were Catholic ones and so on. So there were all kinds of specialized gay networks were emerging and advertising themselves.
Hmm.
I was a student, so I belonged to a gay literary group. So we read a novel every week. And then we all went to the bathhouse together and tried to get laid. So it was quite a fun thing to do. So
Yeah. And it's interesting, yeah, the gays out bringing all of these different facets of gay life in
yeah,
Montreal in the 70s together.
it was because I think
Yeah.
we were trying to increase content and not be judgmental about. Nothing was too perverse or too conservative or too religious for us to
Hmm.
put in the newspaper.
Hmm.
And from there, it was New York. Uh, yeah.
Yeah. So you're right at this point, this is from your series Christopher Street from 1976. So you're right in the heart of the gay scene, gay life in Manhattan
And,
in the later 1970s. How did you end up in New York?
well, I met a fellow business student at one of the gay dances that were organized by Gay McGill, who was a bit older than me. He finished his MBA first, and uh, he was foreign, he was Swiss, and uh, basically complained a lot about North America. And so we said he should go home back to Europe. But so he got himself a job at JP Morgan and trained in New York, and then came to work in London partly because I couldn't have followed him to a non-English speaking country. So I followed him to New York, and then I followed him further on to London. So this was the early days. I had, I was still a student, and I'd enrolled in an MBA in New York. It was here that also my more hobby-like interest in photography turned into more, I guess, professional interest because I'd never seen a kind of two things. And there was this huge, very public gay world of this parade of uh, gay people every weekend like this on the pictures. And there was this enormous photographic art world, which I'd never seen before either.
Mhm.
And so I was drawn to both those things and uh, very quickly gave up my business school to do this. But again, these are pictures that I was just taking for myself, and they were never seen or published till about 2018 when they suddenly appeared as a book
Mhm.
for the first time. Yeah.
When you were taking them, did you have a sense of an audience for them or a desire to capture this scene? What was the intention behind the work?
Yeah, it came from there was this idea in prevalent at the time that and I was taking some classes at the new school, so as photo students, we felt like everything had needed to be photographed, so it kind of presages the digital age in a way. So we thought we weren't put off by the fact that we were analog, but we thought we should use our cameras to document and record everything. And part of everything that was legitimate was street scenes. And what was very interesting to audiences in New York were New York street scenes, because
Mhm.
you see them in the museums, and so I hit the streets in New York to just take random pictures and then began to hone it down to particular neighborhoods. And then very quickly, I realized that my neighborhood, West Village, was of the greatest interest to me. So then I took the largest amount of pictures of this just I think just because I could do it and because it was fun, and it was like cruising with a camera because there were clearly too many guys and not enough time. And besides, I was supposed to be there with someone, and I couldn't have everyone, but I could photograph everyone. So I went around shooting people like fancied mainly, and had a like yeah that kind of very brief encounter.
It's interesting how many of them don't always return. Some of them return your gaze, some of them don't. Did you have conversations with any of them in the process of sort of cruising them with your camera?
Not really, because I was interested in the next person coming along, and they were promenading really. So they wanted, so they were showing themselves off, but yeah, they weren't really interested in stopping and chatting so much, not on the street. It had that New York feeling of bustle, you know, of this constant flow and movement of people.
And this place to see and be seen
Yeah,
as well. I
exactly.
think that there's so many different looks going off in different angles as well. So you moved to London then
Yeah,
in the late 1970s, early 1980s.
yeah, 78, 79. That's right.
What were your
Where
what were your sort of initial feelings about London when you arrived?
initially I was very depressed actually. Uh, so I came from this very vibrant gay scene that operated all night and was very sociable to this other kind of and this other environment here. And we moved specifically to Earl's Court at the time. This is 78 because we were told that that's the equivalent of the West Village's gay subculture. We would find it there. And so we arrived there. And aside from our landladies being a lesbian couple, it didn't seem that gay, you know, like what I was used to. Like maybe every sixth person might be gay. It wasn't like every other person. And also, everything to do with London was a huge culture shock, and I was very unprepared for it. You know, it's a cliche, but you know what I mean. It's like the hours were different. Everything shut at 10:30. I'd go out at 11:30, and everything had closed by then. And if there was the odd place open, and it wouldn't serve you any alcohol, that kind of thing. And you couldn't hold anybody's hand in a pub. I sensed there was very lot of anxiety. Uh, and actually, I didn't appreciate one of those uh, enormous differences between New York and London, where the British had legalized the sexual act, but had uh, had made cruising basically illegal by calling it soliciting, and they used that to entrap and arrest a lot of gay men at that time, and people were wary, you know, and I guess partly also the culture, maybe, you know. Uh, when I go to bars and pubs in this country, nobody really wants to speak to you. So maybe it's the way I look, but it's not really like in Canada or the US where whoever's next to you will just say hi. You know, they don't mean anything. Doesn't mean I want to drag you home with me. Just because you're occupying the space next to me, you say hello. You know. So I used to do that when I first came, but I quickly learned not to do that. People weren't very receptive.
So when you arrived, you had this culture shock experience and
Yeah.
this sense that the way that people occupied public space and behaved towards each other was really different. What spaces did you find for gay community and kind of meeting other gay men, or also for some of that gay organizing that you'd been involved with in Canada? What
Well,
spaces were there?
it came through the photography finally, you know, because I guess the two of us had arrived here, both foreigners as a couple, and so we were not going to meet anyone. And then I had gone to study photography in this art school in Farnham in Surrey. And for those of you who don't know it, it's like a very wealthy market town. And uh, at the time, the college's policy was pretty anti-gay, because the age of consent, also remember in the late 70s, was 21. And I was a slightly mature student in my early 20s, trying to make gay work, like what we're looking at here about gay switchboard. But the college made it clear to me that my fellow students were underage and that my work would be seen as proselytizing, and they weren't happy with it. Anyway, I went ahead nonetheless. So although I was stuck out in Farnham, I came to London to the scene and found this photographic way of getting to know it. So by doing a documentary on London Gay Switchboard, and one of the exciting things about it is that it told everyone where to go. The project itself died when I first made it, because that's the project more in its entirety, because a lot of the switchboard people were kind of divided about whether they liked it or not, because I'd made this sort of critical photo art piece, which was not exactly just a straight documentary about what they did. And I had other kinds of pictures in it by Robert Mapplethorpe and that kind of thing. So they weren't very happy about that. So I couldn't show it to anyone. This is another thing that immediately didn't get shown and was resurrected much later. But as you can see, it gave me an excuse to go to nightclubs like Heaven and hang out with a camera, and meet people that way.
It's really interesting how looking at your work in like across your career in this way, I'm struck by the color here and how the way that you're approaching figures is very different, because these are people that you're friends with, that are sort of part of your close community, rather than people you're photographing on the street.
Yeah, it was a challenge. It was shooting. I was just experimenting, shooting in a place like Heaven with very little light and all that, and using film and whatnot. I had to use people's shoulders as a tripod because I had very long exposures, as you can see. But luckily, those disco lights essentially are a flash, so that's quite helpful. And the management was very easygoing about it. I think most people who even saw me with a camera didn't think that you could take a picture because it was pretty dark. So I didn't get much adverse reaction to it. Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about Gay Switchboard and what you were trying to do in taking photographs of gay life in London at this time?
Well, Gay Switchboard was, and I might still be, was the largest LGBT non-government organization that existed in London. And subsequently, I realized in the activist circles anyway, everybody's done their time there. It's a kind of rite of passage that when you're 20, you go and volunteer there. And so this was mine. I didn't volunteer there, but I hung around and took pictures of them and interviewed various people there. And it actually helped me to set up shop with some other people around gay Black people and gay Asian people in particular, because Switchboard was on Caledonian Road and near Houseman's Bookshop. And then there was a place called London Friend, which we used for other kinds of meetings. So yeah, it was hugely influential, I think, much beyond its advice giving, helpline thing. It was there would be regular meetings of the volunteers, and there would be, 30, 40 people discussing something. And, I mean, where else would you find that outside of, an academic conference or something?
So people were there's a real politics underpinning.
There was. Yeah. And also it was by now 81. So there was a lot of battles being fought and coming, and there was some progress being made. Age of consent, that kind of thing. yeah, and AIDS hadn't happened yet, so it was still around, largely around the soliciting laws, the pretty police and the age of consent, stuff like that.
So the series kind of somewhat predates the HIV and AIDS epidemic in Britain,
Yeah,
but the network was very important in
yeah,
responding to AIDS in Britain.
yeah. And then I met a whole bunch of people around that time who then were living in West London, where I had been living. Yeah.
You mentioned, or sort of addressed, the groups like the Gay Black group and the experience of LGBT Black people and South Asian people in Britain. Could you say a wee bit more about your experience of that at this time and how it kind of related to these things we've been talking about spaces for community and political organizing?
Well, I arrived kind of very gay liberationist primarily, and that was my primary identity. And my Asian or Indian identity I had kind of put aside because it had been not very useful to me in Canada, and in New York even less so. People really didn't know what to make of it. But when I arrived in England, I became aware that here it was an identity that was well known, and it was also hugely problematic. And there was this kind of racism going on in the public that I only slowly became aware of, and that it could happen to people like me, who were relatively, I guess, protected. So I think I was on my way from West London to college. I was in at the RCA to South Kensington, and some well-dressed guy on the tube said to me, "I think you should go home." And I thought he was telling me to go back to my flat, and I said, "Well, I just come from there." We're like, "What do you mean?" And so what he meant was like, go back to India or something, that kind of thing. And then, so that race awareness actually began more in my school at the RCA, surprisingly, where a bunch of us met, students of color, not around the gay thing. The gay scene, the commercial gay scene, was very, very white, and I just took it for granted. I didn't expect to see many, and I didn't see any, and I didn't think it was a problem till then, until after '83, which is when I became more kind of color conscious, and we had a black show at the RCA, and then on graduation, I turned my back to Cork Street and went to the GLC across the river and got involved with local politics and town halls and minorities very much so. And basically,
so the GLC, the Greater London Council.
London Council, yeah. And this whole empowerment of minorities, everybody from elderly people to LGBT to Asians and blacks and so on. And then I remember being part of something called Ethnic Minorities Unit on the periphery of it. And then one of the early victories was to rename it as the Race Equality Unit. So we didn't think being a minority as a title was very helpful. So actually, some of us who are my age are really appalled that the UK is having this ridiculous BAME idea again. Like, where did that come from? I thought we put it to bed in the 80s. It suddenly seems to be back, so that kind of thing. So culturally, some of us became black. There was a whole black idea as a post-colonial moment.
Of solidarity.
Of solidarity. So I really emerged from art school in a very kind of both post-colonial and postmodern. Those were the two key things that you kind of came out into. And in terms of postmodernity and references, I became aware that all of my references now were going to be from India, and they were again not going to work because they had no precedent here. Like being gay and Indian had no precedent, so I had really a problem. I didn't know where to start, with my own self, because there was nothing in our classroom or in art history to refer to. Anyway, so
you felt that you had to produce that.
I felt
yourself.
It became my duty almost to produce something. That was my activism, was to produce something. that could then later on, hopefully, be a stepping stone to then getting away from that very elementary appreciation of it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, so
So
this
these are.
picture, this is Earl's Court, and that's what I came out into. So these are some. So as you can see, it's empty, unlike Christopher Street. So you had to, it was a bit awkward lurking and then leaping out in front of complete strangers to take a picture. So they would be quite surprised mostly.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a bit more populated. It's more in the West
Mm-hmm.
End, but again, their gay couples were sort of isolated in the sea of heterosexuality.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it was. So this is going to be a book in September. So some of
Mm-hmm.
these pictures, and then the wider set of pictures showing how really not very gay things were in a public setting.
Mm-hmm. And with this, I think you're playing with. There's an interplay between the text and the image that comes up in
Yeah, there's Mind Your
a lot of
Blacks in the
your, yeah, a lot of your
yeah,
work.
yeah,
There's a lot of billboards.
yeah,
They play a very particular role in quite a lot of your work, but also text,
yeah.
text and image, and
Yeah, I wanted to. It's a way of to bring the gay and the black thing together because
mm-hmm,
I
mm-hmm,
wasn't seeing any black gays on the streets very visibly at that time to photograph.
mm-hmm. And then in the mid 1980s, you end up back in
Yeah, I
India,
went
and
back.
you're making work there. Yeah.
Yeah. So
What
again, with
precipitated that move?
well,
What's your
uh,
journey?
it was my photography work again, and a curiosity to go back as an adult. I hadn't been back ever. I never had the money to go back. To go back in my 20s to this country where I had grown up and had this quite amazing sex life, but no conversation about it. And I wanted to go back and see, well, was there some kind of influence of the gay liberation movement here? Were they talking about something there? And so I actually went to India to do something else for work, but whenever I passed through the cities, I would try and take some pictures. So this is a random documentary shot. If I saw guys together, then I would try and take a picture, which and sometimes they would get published like this. But by and large, I found that there was complete silence in the 80s in India around gay identities. Uh, this was my best friend and informer, Salim Kidwai, a historian. And we were the two out gays, and we met in McGill in Canada at that gay McGill. He decided to go home and work there and to do things from there. And I decided home, like India, this is Delhi, was just too stifling for me. I was like too out and proud, and I couldn't live in a place where you couldn't mention you were gay at a dinner party. It was that bad.
Mm-hmm.
So, but we remained very close friends. And so uh, we just took this as a random snap, which I can now share with you because things have vastly changed in India. But
Mm-hmm.
obviously, back in the day, this was not a picture I could have shown.
And it's interesting to look at this photograph of you in front of the Qutub Minar and this important Delhi landmark, because this becomes a big
Yeah,
feature in the series Exiles that you make in the mid to late 1980s.
yeah, and a picture from that shoot, that's the same friend on the left. And
Mm-hmm,
so there, this was my pre-exile, this kind of trying to find some gay Indian image by not revealing who the people were. And so again, another shot that's been lying in the archives and only recently exhumed for and appeared in Aperture. Aperture just made an issue on Delhi,
mm.
and so they use this.
And so it's that
Yeah,
this archival ephemera that not part work that you took that's not part of these formal series that's being kind of reactivated now.
it is. I think. Well, I just took a lot of pictures. I'm one of those. I'm a shooter, So I think this is, we can put that down to our college system. So I was really art school bred, where it involved a lot of materiality, and I needed a lot of stuff, you know. And my friends who went to more theoretical schools like PCL with Victor Bergen were terrified to take any pictures at all in case they were unethical in some way or something. So they only took 10 pictures. But I have this vast collection, which is kind of a minefield now of wonderful stuff.
It's incredibly valuable for, well, like you say, it documents something that didn't seem to exist, or it was difficult to talk about.
Yeah, it
publicly.
keeps popping up here and there, you know. So actually, this COVID year of staying at home all the time has been quite good for looking at the archives. But this disappeared at the time. So this is 82. So there's my same friend. So this is the first picture we did with his head cut off at my favorite cruising ground. I grew up next to this tomb. It's the same tomb that appears in Exiles. As a boy, I discovered it was very handy, fairly anonymous cruising site right next to where I lived. And it's also where we played as kids. And so, yeah.
So this
But
was
nobody
published
was
in the
talking.
Guardian.
Yeah, in 82, because I used to, I began to work as an editorial photographer. That was my living, actually, in the 80s. So I used to go around with photographic portfolio, and the Guardian editors, picture editor said, "Is there a story?" And then I said, "Oh, I'll write one for you." And then in about 83, then this is now about the kinship thing. So the person I'd come to live with and I broke up after I resolved all of my immigration problems, which meant that I'd finally graduated from all my degrees and I had no further reason to stay. And the Home Office would say, "Oh, dear Mr. Gupta, we think you should now leave, go home to Canada." You know, and there were no PhDs then, so I had to leave. But I came back, and I managed to get back as an artist. And then when things should have been fine, things were not fine at all, and so we split up. And 3 weeks later, I met this guy very casually. I'd been to a tea party in Earl's Court, and uh, so when we got home, I took a picture of him. That's the picture I took. One of the pictures I took, because when I used to meet people, so uh, I tried to invest it with as much, you know, as I could, and if I liked someone, I quite liked the guy, and I thought if I was going to see more of him, he needed to be photogenic because if I date you, then you end up in all the work, and so you got to look, you know, okay. So that was that picture on the left, and I just thought and through him there was a whole network of people which we'll just get into. But that's him on the right. Just last week, I just thought I'll show you what, you know, he's still in my life. He's, you know, we live nearby. He still lives in the flat we shared. And every weekend we go to some National Trust house together. There's a couple of senior gays admiring the properties and the gardens.
And he's still letting you photograph him as well.
Yeah, he is.
Yeah.
He's got used to it now.
Yeah. So these are some photographs of that kind of that community
that's
that
that
you.
network. Yeah. So there
Yeah.
he is on the extreme left with all of his buddies. It was all through him, this group of people. Uh, Youngish, mostly out of London, who came to London to live, Keg boys, in the early 80s. And we're on the tube. I think we're going to a picnic. So next picture. And then we go, I think this is in a pub that may not even have been gay, but maybe it was gay, actually. All I can see is men in it. But so this is a larger kind of group of people. So it was a real friendship network. And I wanted to highlight how that was very important. Uh, So they'd hang out, and then there's one on the tube after this, or yeah. So we're on our way to somewhere like Kew Gardens or something.
Mm.
And so here we were becoming more visible. So this was a little bit later now. This is, I think that kind of West London clone thing became very visible generally. And people took notice of them as that woman is over there.
She is, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
She's intrigued.
Yeah. And then once again, so just a couple of months ago, one of the Tea Party pictures appeared in the New York Times magazine
Mm.
in an illustrated article about friendship in general. And then the same people, so there we are again. That's me and Steve, who now become part of the work. And this was on part of the Black Experience exhibition at the Brixton
Mhm.
Art Gallery in '86, and has many years later been acquired by the Tate. And the whole series of that is going up in London in September. And then some of the other couples from 10 years on were also part of that group. That's how I met them. So that's on the right hand side is an example from 10 years on. Uh,
So that's a series in which you're thinking about friendship and kinship, but about relationships,
yeah,
long relationships that have lasted
for
a
some time
decade.
because when mine ended, the first one, I was a bit shocked. I didn't think it was going to happen to me. It's one of those things that happens to other people. I was completely unprepared for it. Uh, uh, I don't know why, because it's not like it didn't happen to everyone. But anyway, there you go. Yeah, so 10 years on was a product of that. And it was also just at the cusp of AIDS. So uh, we've lost many of those people, but I never go into that because I didn't make it like that. It was really before. So it's not, what's the word? It's not a memorial for AIDS.
Hmm. And you don't
Uh,
want to read that into the
that's
work.
not
That's not something you were thinking
not
about at the
that's not
time.
what I
Yeah.
was thinking about. No, it was more celebrating the moment they were in. It had a brief exhibition history. There's a little cutout from a magazine called City Limits that used to be the more radical people working for Time Out walked out one day, started their own magazine. Yeah, so that's 10 years on again. And that's the
So,
beginning of it. So AIDS came along. Yeah.
and AIDS becomes a pretty major part of your work and your life later
Yeah,
on.
it does. So the media, as we know, notoriously in Britain was really bad, especially the tabloids. So this page that I worked on was for News on Sunday. That was an attempt at a left-wing tabloid. I don't know if anybody remembers it. Maybe someone in the audience. It didn't survive uh, the first issue, but that was my page on AIDS. So one of the couples from 10 years on, some of the other people from the network, and yeah,
I was just going to say we've got quite a few photos here that explore the ways in which HIV and AIDS impacted your community in London at this time. So,
yeah, very much so. So that's Princess Di. She came to visit Body Positive. Body Positive was a HIV peer group that was set up in Earl's Court, and standing right behind her is Nick Banton, who was running it. And Nick was also one of my couples from 10 years on. So I just wanted to show that relationship, that
mhm.
things were happening on and off camera, and the people had different roles, sometimes more directly, like Nick, working inside organizations. And so then they would ask people like me to come and take pictures.
Mhm.
Uh, and there's a reference to the Black Gay Group,
Mhm.
that met at Gay's the Word. It must have been tiny. We met at the back of Gay's the Word. I went back to have a look recently. There must have been only 6 people in the group. But anyway, but see, that was our description of black, you see.
Mhm.
It didn't mean literally just black.
As we
And
as we use it now, yeah. And
yeah,
you can watch there's a short documentary about the gay black group that people can watch on the BFI player for free as well, to find out more
and
about that. Yeah.
and then I got involved with camera work, and then we had the LGBT show. That was the other picture. So and then
Mhm.
so a lot of Asians and gays didn't go to the commercial scene, but went to house parties. So this is a house party which mainly had gay men of color. So they were mainly Caribbean, Black, or South Asian, or Latino. And they were great party. You can imagine the music was fantastic.
This
And
looks like a brilliant party.
yeah. Uh, yeah, and lurking in the back is Kobina Mercer, who later became a well-known
Oh
black
yeah,
academic.
yeah, yeah. Very
I was
well
about
known
to say,
art historian. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I was going to say to him, you can't wear a tie to a party. You're going to get laid that way.
Listening intently to the music there, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's given that we've been talking about HIV and AIDS to say
Yeah.
something about ecstatic antibodies, because there's a lot of interest in that exhibition now.
Yeah. So that was in 1988. I went to a meeting at what used to be the London Lesbian and Gay Centre in Farringdon about AIDS and HIV, and about 50 people were there, and much of it was about activism. And I suggested we do an art show, which was very unpopular idea. I think people wanted to do direct action and lie down on the streets. But a woman raised her hand, Tessa Boffin, and she and I got together and we decided we'll do our exhibition. And we were both fairly recent graduates. She'd been to the theory school, luckily, so she knew all that kind of thing that I didn't know. So she'd been to uh, PCL, and then she'd been to Sussex and all that. And so we decided our book wouldn't just be a catalog; that we needed to have proper text. So then the book has writers, and it took us 2 years to raise money from the Arts Council and find a publisher for the book. And it became a big touring show. And it started at Impressions Gallery in New York. They were the sponsor, and it had a great tour. And it was formulated, it was conceptualized as a very queer response to the messaging that we were getting, which was very anti-queer and anti-sex from our government at the time. So the show was literally promoting promiscuity and safer sex, but to have lots of
Mhm.
it with as many people as possible in as many ways as possible. So quite contrary to the government. And so sometimes we have problems with this in some venues. I think at the Icon Gallery in Birmingham, for example, one of the works had to be put into a box. But by and large, it did do fairly well. Unfortunately, several people involved with it are also not around. So it's another project that's in danger of being a memorial because
Mhm.
Tess is not here, Rotimi Fani Kayode is not here, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Mhm.
And the thing is that when we did it, which I should point out, is that we were young and really enthusiastic and were thinking change was on its way, Aside from the horrible Clause 28, a lot of other things had begun to change. And we lived in this very mixed world, and which may have been, of course, a South London bubble, but you certainly slept with people other than your own race, hopefully, and men and women went out together. So we were trying to get away from the same sex, same everyone the same in one club idea. So me and Tessa could go out disco dancing together, So and the venue would be the Market Tavern. So some nights would be very clony, other nights they would have the Clit Club in there and stuff like that. And the London and Lesbian Gay Centre started to have Sadie Maisie, which was the acronym for S&M, where they were both men and women. And Tessa used to perform by getting up on a stage with a dildo. And, I don't know if I can say that, but basically she was fucking gay men on stage with a
Mhm.
dildo. And to us, that became a definition of queer, that kind of turning around of things.
Mhm.
And also it was very performative. So you were really performing. So I don't know whether the the Sydney stuff had come out then, the performative. I don't know what year that came out in. Anyway, we won't make this too academic, but basically, sometimes you see the guys would come to Tessa and say, "Can I have your number?" Then we can, and she would say, "No, of course you can't. We only do it in this way, performing, with an audience on a stage. It's not like she wants to fuck you, in private, as a kind of date situation. That wasn't what it was about."
Mhm.
And
But
so, but what I'm saying is that we lived in this way, and then people's lives reflected that. So Tessa began to live as a drag queen, as a gay drag queen, as a gay male drag. That makes sense. But anyway, so you go shopping to Sainsbury's like a drag queen. So that. So that all. So we were very. It was a very. What should I say? Very exciting time in a way where the politics was real and you lived according to it and you changed your lifestyle accordingly. Like it was. I didn't see that anywhere else in the world. Not in New York, not in San Francisco, not in Delhi, where people were so racially intermingled and gender. At those few years, they just seemed really very experimental. Yeah.
I mean, that comes across so clearly looking at the Ecstatic Antibodies book, that sense of pleasure and playfulness and desire and solidarity between genders. But as you say, this is in a context where the context of HIV and AIDS, poor government response, really toxic homophobia and anti-sex kind of propaganda in the media, but also Section 28 as well, which is impacting LGBT people of all ages, and has had a long impact as well. Maybe we should talk, just as we wrap up. I'd love to hear about the work that so you went back to Delhi in the early 2000s.
Yeah, 2005.
Could you say a bit more about, I mean, you'd spent time there in the mid 1980s.
Yeah.
What was it like when you got there in the early 2000s, and what was life like for LGBTQ people in Delhi at that time? What sort of communities were you coming across?
Well, again, it was triggered by an exhibition. It was through my work. I hadn't been to India in the 90s very much. I was slightly put off from the 80s experience and the complete, what apparent hopelessness of the situation. And then, yeah, so in 2003, I turned 50, which was a milestone. And I also had an exhibition the following year. My curator friends in Delhi said, you come in research here, but you never show here. And I think they thought the time was good to show something of what I do. And so for the first time, we showed Exiles and From Here to Eternity, the AIDS series, and a couple of other things. And there was a huge response to it. And I suddenly felt like, wow, there was this whole new changing atmosphere and an audience, and that people were excited to meet you, and people wanted to know how to make things happen, and people were trying to make things happen. And I met this bunch of young people. That's one of them in the picture there, and they were coming out of college. They were all grad students, and they formed a queer group, and they're now becoming queer. Queer theory arrived through academia, and then kind of leaked out into the town. Everybody in India is now queer, it seems. But anyway, so they kind of adopted me, and I joined. They persuaded me to join them, even though I was older than their parents. And then, of course, a little corollary on the side is that, meanwhile, I met this guy. There's always a guy. So I met this guy, and then I fell in love with it. I moved to Delhi with my suitcase, and then the guy disappeared. But then I ended up staying there and trying to work with this group, and various cultural interesting things happened. And then I also
you met another guy.
Yeah, and then quite a few years later, I then met another guy through the HIV business, and there we got married. So I did a whole U-turn. I'd been very anti-marriage, gay marriage, most of my life, and then I got married. So it was, well, we had an excuse. The only way they would ever let him into the UK, because in 2012, I was exploring the boundaries of exhibition in India with queer content, and I found it in 2012. I had to put up a show of Sun City, and the police were summoned, and I had a very ugly showdown, and the show was closed, and worse things could have happened. And I decided to not become a martyr in India. and I just didn't have the money. It's like it drains your bank account doing these things. And so I just quietly withdrew back to South London. But this time with somebody. So the two of us came here a little bit shell shocked, not sure what we would do here, not really knowing anybody, because my history of all of that group of people was completely shattered through AIDS and through time and through people just moving around. The black cards thing had also seemed to have died. I just didn't know where to go. And so, well, as you know, Fiona, both of us enrolled in PhDs to keep us busy. So that's what we.
Yeah. Well, we're nearly out of time, so
Okay.
perhaps we could conclude just by you saying a little bit about what you're working on now, because you've got quite a few books that have come out recently, and the retrospective that was at the Photographers Gallery. But you're also involved in sharing your archives, so through book publications and exhibitions. And also collaborating with later generations of queer artists and curators and art historians.
Yeah, I'm very lucky that I've landed kind of on my feet, and I've got a commercial gallery now, so it's making it financially possible to have this loft, and we're using it as a site. And also, we've decided to focus on the next generation, like the under 40s or something, 35s, I was saying. But Sharon said that excludes him then. So anyway, I forgot he's over 35. Anyway, so so there's a bunch of artists that come, and sometimes other kind of young academics come and get involved. So there's a couple of books definitely maybe happening. So there's another photo book of the London street pictures. There's going to be a textbook, which is first for me, of collected all my writings for just waiting for it to be signed off by the publisher, well-known photo publisher. So that will come out next year. Steve and I recently both realized that we have our correspondence. We wrote letters to each other because he did his PhD at Columbia, and I was paying the mortgage here in London, and we wrote long letters to each other. And so actually Theo's been helping me edit those. So we want to publish that. I think there might be some interest in them. It's a kind of intimate correspondence between two gay guys right in the middle of those 80s, London, New York. There are these two perspectives.
And I really I really like that idea that you're working with a younger gay person, Theo Gordon, the art historian, to edit them, so that connection across generations is really woven into the way that you're working as well.
Oh yeah, no, I love working with younger people. So I've been in the periphery of higher education sometimes. In fact, my best classes were actually in India, which was got the weather for it. But we would sit outside under a tree to have seminars. But anyway, it's. I find my generation, I know this is about seniors. Hello, seniors. Seniors can become, very bitter and twisted and very set in their ways. So me and Steve survive as a friendly. I've got several exes, actually. I seem to have met everyone through sleeping with them somehow. So they're now my good friends, luckily. So
well, it's brilliant to see all of this. To see your life and work and through these images, and if people want to find out more, they can. You've got a great website, but you've also got these books coming up as well. Some recently published, some soon to come out. So I think that's all we've got time for. So thank you very much for joining us, and remember that you can donate to Silver Pride by going to silverprideuk.com, and your donation will go to supporting grassroots LGBT+ groups. And stay tuned to Silver Pride for more interviews, discussions, book readings, music, and much more. Finally, thank you. Thank you, Sunil.
Thank you, Fiona. Thanks, everyone.